Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 12 of Interaction Design, 4th edition. Chapter 12 is entitled Interaction Design in Practice. And in this chapter, we talk about AgileUX, or Agile interaction design, design patterns, open source resources, and tools for the interaction designer. And this is a really practical chapter with a lot of good ideas that I really like. So just before we get into Agile development, I just want to talk about what's going on in kind of the history of software development and kind of how we got to Agile development. So people have been developing software since, say, the 1950s, okay, in any great quantity. And in the beginning, people didn't put a whole lot of work into what the requirements were, and they certainly didn't put a lot of work into the interaction design. And in fact, the people who developed the code, a lot of times were the people who were going to use the code. You know, the first users of computing were people like engineers and scientists. So this whole idea about how to design the interaction and how to gather the requirements was probably less important because the people who were developing the code were, in fact, going to be using the code. They could kind of consult with themselves as they went along. Well, starting in the 1960s, we started to develop a lot more software, and at this point, we're probably at the pinnacle of the amount of software that we're turning out each year. And it's definitely true that the people who are going to be using the software are typically not the developers of the software. And so in the time that's gone by between the 1950s and now, there have been a series of changes in the methodological approach to developing software to try to get better at it. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to understand the user requirements more fully, to design an interaction that supports the user's job more fully, and to turn out a quality product. So a lot of different groups of people have been working on this problem independently. The software developers, probably the biggest thing that they're doing these days is that they're doing this Agile software development. Okay? And in Agile software development, instead of creating a big requirements document up front, and tons of design documentation, Agile development has them doing a little planning work up front and then going through a series of iterations where they they pick a subset of the requirements, and they address them in these short iteration cycles. The most popular of these is a methodology called Scrum, and in Scrum, the iteration is called a sprint. And they're probably 2 to 4 weeks long. I see that we say on the slide here 1 to 4, but that's 2 to 4, I think, would be more appropriate. Okay. So we don't get all the requirements up front. this becomes a challenge for any kind of approach to interaction design where we expect to do all the interaction design up front. Okay, and so this chapter is kind of taking the stuff that we talked about in previous ones where we said, well, here's the process of interaction design, assuming that all of it goes before development. Okay, although we did talk about prototyping. Okay, so we did at least address that possibility. But we kind of had this idea we're going to do all the interaction design up front. And one of the interesting things is the interaction designers are kind of late to the party, right? So early computer applications were designed by the users. And then they were designed by systems analysts and software developers. But the interaction designer has been fighting for recognition for, well, really ever since the 1960s, but certainly in the 2000s, interaction designers have gotten a lot of traction. We have almost all interactive digital products now. People can see that there are big differences between the quality and the appeal and the usability of well-designed interactive products. So people are pretty well sold on the idea of having an interaction designer associated with a project or interaction designers associated with a project. But and that I think is certainly an accomplishment that's come about in the last, say, 20 years. But most teams, or a lot of software development teams, are not going to give the interaction designers this big period up front to come up with an elaborate, comprehensive interaction design. And all the chapters we've had before this kind of hint at that's what we're going to do, okay? So we're kind of saying, okay, now if you're working with in an organization that's doing Agile software development, you're going to have to do the same activities, but maybe you're going to have to package them up a little differently, okay? Now, before we get into the issue of how are you going to package them up a little differently, let's talk about how this is going to affect the project, the final project you're going to do for this course, because this is not a software development course. And in fact, many of the students in our class are not software developers. And so we are talking about learning the interaction design process and doing it in a way where we actually do the design before we would do the development, because we're not doing the development in this course. So a lot of this Agile stuff maybe is not going to be included in your project unless you have some project that you're doing on the job. You are a software developer. You do have this, kind of Agile kind of infrastructure, Agile software development infrastructure around you. But I'm going to say that you're going to be the unusual member of our class if you're in those circumstances. So these are great ideas, and I think very important to really using these skills that we're learning on the job. But I'm going to have the caveat here, you might not need to apply this in your final project, because your final project is probably not going to be implemented at all as a working software product. And so you're not going to, if you're not going to implement it at all, you're not going to implement it in an Agile way, so you're not going to have these issues. Okay? Good. So in Agile development, instead of doing it the older way, which is to do all of the requirements analysis up front, to document all the requirements up front, and to do a pretty extensive design up front, and then start to build the parts of the system pretty late on in the project. Instead of doing that, we're going to break it up into these time boxes that we typically call sprints, because I'm typically working with people who are using the Scrum approach to Agile, so that's the name that they use. Okay, they're about 2 to 4 weeks long. We are doing some work up front before we start the first true sprint, in which we're trying to get a vision for the project and an overall product roadmap. And in fact, we don't say vision for the project. We usually say a vision for the product and a product roadmap. And then we go into the first of the sprints, in which we pick a subset of the requirements for the product that are usually expressed as user stories, and we collect the rest of the requirements and we do the implementation. And we do that one sprint at a time. Okay? If people like this, because every time you get done with the sprint, you get a customer and user feedback. Okay? And you have real software. Okay? As you come to begin the next of the sprints, you can reprioritize the work based upon the feedback that you've gotten. And so if in fact if you discover that requirements have changed, or you discover new requirements, you can document those and decide to include them in the product backlog, which is simply a collection of the user stories that you've committed to. And then every time you come to a new sprint, when you go to plan it, you pick the most high priority group of user stories that you think can fit into the sprint. So that's how you would do it with Scrum. There are several competing Agile approaches, including extreme programming, often called XP, Scrum, which is the most popular, and DSDM, which has been talked about earlier in our text. So, you'll be happy to know that people have given some pretty careful thought, and they've gone out and they've gained some pretty useful experience and practical experience on how we could do our interaction design in an Agile way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the most promising ways that we've seen to do that. So our Agile approach to interaction design integrates the techniques from both interaction design and Agile software development. It's going to require a change in the mindset, because we're going to adopt some of the principles and philosophies of Agile software development, and that's going to maybe change a little bit of the practices that we're going to do. So maybe our practices will be a little different. Maybe our work products will be maybe a little less formal, a little less prettied up. Okay. And then the other thing is that the scheduling of how we're going to do our work is going to be very much interwoven with other people on the Agile software development team. Okay? So in Agile, as the implementation proceeds, requirements are elaborated and the requirements are reprioritized. Okay? Whereas in a more waterfall kind of approach, where we go phase by phase by phase by phase, and the schedule looks like a waterfall if it's on a Gantt chart, okay, at least we say we get all the requirements identified and elaborated up front, and we prioritize them all up front. And then if we find some changes, then we change our plan. The Agile approach says a lot of that effort is not well spent. And so we want to do general requirements up front. We want to do general prioritizations. And then we want to begin as soon as we can having these iterations or sprints. So all the techniques that are going to be involved in this user experience design are still relevant, but when we're going to do them and how much of each activity we're going to do, we have to rethink a bit. And I mentioned that just a little while ago. So we're going to focus on the product, not the design, because we're very close to the product. The product is being created as we work, okay? Or it's going to be created very soon after we do our work. So we're interested less in these design artifacts and more in the actual software product itself. Okay, so maybe some of our design artifacts, because of that, will be maybe lower fidelity, not quite so prettied up, because what's really going to represent the design when we show it off is likely to be the product itself. We're going to be working on cross-functional teams because we're going to be doing the interaction design and the software development at the same time. So the interaction designer is not going to be a person or a department that works on the front end and then they hand over things to the developers. They're all going to be working together in an integrated effort. So how would this impact our user research? Okay, so to remind you of what user research is, it aims to characterize users through data collection and analysis. So Agile's time boxing approach does not support long periods of user research. Okay, so because these Agile projects, they get planned and they start and they develop things as they go along. Okay, now how can we deal with that? Well, two ideas I think are, well, there are really three ideas that we talk about in the book. The first idea that we talk about in the text is, okay, maybe the software developers don't want to put a lot of effort up front, but the interaction designers can. And so we're going to do a pretty involved user study up front, even before we start the software development process. Well, that sounds promising, okay. But the next idea I think is even more promising, which is they talk about the Microsoft approach to research on their products, where they have a group of people who are researching what their customers want and how their customers like to interact with their products all the time. Okay, and then individual development efforts are always informed by that. So they're not starting from zero, right? The other idea is that most Agile practitioners will have this thing that they either call a sprint zero or they don't call it sprint at all. They call it some kind of a planning activity where they develop the vision for the product. They develop the road map for developing and implementing the product. And what we're going to say, and let's call this sprint 0, and we're just going to say, well, we're going to do our original bundle of user research and interaction design activities during the sprint 0 time. Okay. Now, if we decide that we want to have it our own way and we want to design the complete product up front, it's not going to work all that practically. Well, why is that? Well, we're going to design a lot of things that never get implemented. One of the major principles of the Agile approach to software development is what I would call software requirements Darwinism. Okay? And that's to say, we take all of our requirements and we express them as user stories, and we put them into a pile that we call the backlog, and we prioritize them. And only the ones that get to the top of the pile ever get implemented. Okay? And so they have to compete for the attention of the team. It's a real survival of the fittest. So that at the end of a typical Agile software development project, we're going to have a group of user stories that express requirements that didn't make it into the product in this project. And that's okay. These are the things that the next project is made of. So that's not a problem. Okay. But in a world where we're not absolutely sure up front what all the features are going to be that are going to get included, doing the interaction design for a complete set of features is probably not time well spent. Because by the time we get to actually implementing that part of the software, the features will have changed enough that the design will be stale. And so it won't be very long before people just really abandon our interaction design. So instead of doing that, what a number of people have done, which seems to be the best approach so far, is to do Agile interaction design, okay, or AgileUX, as I call it in the chapter here, and to do it as part of this time-boxed iterative approach, to have a parallel interaction design track that goes through the iterations, and essentially to lead the implementers by either 1 or 2 iteration periods. So we're not getting, yes, we're getting ahead of the implementers, but not very, okay? If the iterations are 2 weeks long, we're at most 4 weeks ahead of the implementers, probably 2. If the iterations are 4 weeks long, we could get as much as 8 weeks ahead of the implementers. But compare that to doing all the design up front on a project that's going to take half a year or a year. We could be months ahead of the implementers, and we could wind up with a stale design that doesn't take long before it gets ignored. Okay? So there's pretty good, very good documentation in the chapters to different researchers who have gone to talk to practitioners who have used this parallel approach and reported back on its success in the field, which has been good. Okay? So in this parallel tracks approach, because we're creating a product vision before the development starts, and this is product vision is a term of art from the Scrum version of Agile. It's one of the documents that we create. Because we're doing that, We've got a pretty good idea of the overall design, okay, and we're having, I think, a pretty good idea of what's kind of coming up as probably going to be the stuff that's going to be in the first iteration, because we prioritize these things. We prioritize these user stories as we put them into the backlog. And so we just have our interaction design team work one sprint ahead. So while the developer team is working on the product vision and those kinds of things in this sprint 0, well, our interaction designer or designers, excuse me, I'm sorry. This recording technology is everything but a cough button. The designers in this sprint 0, iteration 0, are working on the interaction design for the first sprint. Okay? Some teams have been doing it 2 iterations ahead. Okay? Nobody is recommending that the interaction design team get any more than 2 iterations ahead of the developers. Okay? So here's how it would look. This is, I think, a really interesting diagram, although it's not really showing us they're not really showing us from cycle 0. We should really be showing a design that goes into cycle 1. Okay? So I would draw this a little different. I probably would have I probably would always have the design team, the interaction designer track, providing a design for every one of the cycles or sprints that the developer track does. And this does, I think, a really nice job of explaining everything but how we get into cycle 1 or sprint 1. So I would draw this slightly differently. I think it's an interesting diagram, but it's just the beginning of it is, I think, not correct. Okay, so what are the advantages of this parallel tracks approach? Well, there's no design time wasted on features not implemented, because we really are serious about this kind of experiential approach to developing the system. We really do feel that we're going to learn enough about the requirements as we're going through sprint to sprint to sprint that the prioritization of things is going to change. We're going to realize that some of the features are more important than we thought. We're going to realize that some other features are less important than we thought. In fact, so much less important that perhaps they should just be canceled altogether. And so if we had done this kind of omnibus all over design in the beginning, we would have done an interaction design for things that never got implemented. Okay? Usability testing and contextual inquiry can be done on the same customer visit, saving time. Okay, so at the same time that we're trying to talk with the customers and get the idea about what the requirements are, we can have them do usability testing on the design that we're working on for the last cycle or iteration. Okay? Timely feedback on designs was received from developers and customers, and Agile flexibility supports schedule changes if a problem is found. So the report from the field of doing this in this parallel kind of tracks approach is quite good, and it has a lot of uptake. Now, you have to ask yourself, well, how are my techniques going to change because I'm doing this in an agile way now? And I think I mentioned a few slides ago that you have to start to think of the software itself as the deliverable. Okay? And you have to think of these design artifacts, these prototypes, as being things that are precursors to the deliverable. You also have to realize they're going to have a short life, right? If in fact we did this wide-ranging design up front, people evaluated this whole wide-ranging design, it might be months and months and months till somebody went to implement it. Well, here it's a matter of weeks, okay? So the value of shining up a prototype that is going to have a 2-week or a 4-week or an 8-week life is going to be less than the value of doing those kinds of things with something that has a 6-month life or a 1-year life. Okay? So, historically, the most common way that designers for usability would communicate with developers is through these prototyping documents, these design artifacts. And because Agile really discourages this kind of communication, they really favor discussion and coding over a documentation, then we're only going to want to use the documentation where we need the documentation. So I'm going to say that everything's going to be lower fidelity. It's going to be lower fidelity and it's going to have a shorter life. Okay? Because we're just going to communicate enough to get on the same page before we go build it. Okay? And so when we're trying to figure out how much energy to put into a given piece of documentation, we might want to consider who's going to read it, who's going to use it, what's the minimum that we need. A lot of times the Agile people talk about the value of work not done. Okay, so they want to make sure that we're taking a minimalistic approach to the process. So that would extend to design documentation. Is there duplication anywhere? So we don't want to be documenting things in 2 places for sure. And how polished does it need to be? Okay, well, it needs to be as polished as it needs to be to get the job done. Probably we want to be able to show it to the developers so they understand the interaction as we designed it, right? So that's that. We also probably want to take some of these things to the users and do some amount of user testing and walking through before we give it to the developers, okay? Well, that would mean it'd probably have to be a little higher quality than that, okay? So what might really work for us? Well, what I have in mind here is probably something that's a prototype that's visually low fidelity. Okay, it's not high design. Okay, it looks a bit more like a wireframe than it looks like high design. Okay, but perhaps it is interactive. Perhaps you are able to click from view to view and see how this interaction is going to take place. The value of creating a visual high fidelity, high design prototype, I think is really called into question here. Okay? I think you might want to do some of that, but probably not so much as you would do if you were doing all the design up front. So here in the chapter, I think they do a good job of saying, well, what would it look like to do something in a lower fidelity, lower polish kind of way compared to a higher polish kind of way. And they talked about this user journey documentation that they put together, and they do a really good job with post-it notes, and they say string in the text, but I think that it's really done with post-it notes and whiteboard tools. Okay, and compare this with a user journey, customer journey diagram that we saw an example of about 2 chapters ago. Well, this is the same thing done with many more hours in it. Certainly has a very high fidelity, a high polish, and all that kind of stuff. But might it be too high fidelity and high polish for something that's going to have only a multi-week life? One of the things I like about the chapter so much, probably my favorite part about this one, is the discussion we have of design patterns. So design patterns have been a tool in software design now for 20 or so years. They've been a tool that was used in architectural design for buildings. There was an architectural I guess I could say scholar, but somebody who wanted to teach architecture, and he wanted to teach good design. And he came up with this idea late in the 70s for design patterns, which he said were just good solutions in context. You know, this is the way you design a door. This is the way you design a patio. This is the way you design a portico. Right? That kind of stuff. So the software design people, especially the object-oriented software design people, really jumped on that and said, you know, there are a lot of things that we do. We have kind of tried and true approaches to software designs that seem to work particularly well, and let's identify those. And there's a particularly famous group of software design patterns created by these computer scientists, and they're called the object-oriented software design patterns, and they had 4 authors. A couple of us remember their names, but the rest of us like to call them the Gang of 4. Why? Well, because it's kind of a complimentary way to describe them, and most importantly, you don't have to remember their names. Somewhat a little bit later in the 2000s kind of time frame, this idea came to interaction design. And it's been as popular in interaction design as it has been in structure architecture and software design. Okay? So the idea is we come up with a common favorable way to solve a problem in context. These are general designs. That's why we call them patterns and not designs themselves. So the patterns may be individual in languages, in catalogs, in galleries, or libraries. So there's not a fixed, agreed to way to describe a design pattern for interaction design, although people have tried to design languages to express them in, and people have compiled catalogs and galleries. And in fact, our text has the URLs of 2 particular galleries or libraries that I suggest that you visit. Patterns are often associated with the software components. So we can have a bit of a crossover between software design patterns and interaction design patterns. But I want to say that probably those two, they're two different sets. Maybe have how much intersection is there between the two sets? Well, there's a little bit of overlap in the Venn diagram, but it's not giant. So let's talk about a couple of design patterns that they talk about in the chapter. The first one is a carousel design pattern, which has been around for a while. And this is the design to say what looks like a web page here, or we could be looking at a tablet. And so we're trying to look at a series of images, and we have set them up so that there is a carousel that goes across the bottom, and we're able to use that to navigate to find a thumbnail of the one that we want to look at on a larger scale. And so then we navigate through the carousel, and then we touch it in order to load up the image that we see on top. Now, the question is that a good design or a bad design? And there's a really good discussion in the chapter where they say, well, maybe. I mean, there's some people who think that it was a good design, but it's past its time. And they have some other ideas about what you might want to do instead. There are still people who say, well, compared to just listing out an ugly page full of thumbnails, this is a great pattern and one that you ought to consider, right? So this, I think, really brings up one aspect of the discussion that goes on around design patterns. It's that people talk about patterns being the good example, right? And if there is a bad example, if there is a pattern that's not recommended, it's called an anti-pattern. Okay, so being called a pattern implies good example. Being called an anti-pattern implies bad example. Okay, and to a certain extent they overlap, so that one person's pattern is another person's anti-pattern, but over time things tend to sort themselves out into one of those sets or others. It just so happens that the carousel is kind of on the bubble. There's some people who think that it's still good design, and some people think it's a design that has past its usefulness. Okay. The other kind of pattern that they talk about in the book is a dark pattern. This is a pattern that either leads to bad interaction results, which kind of overlaps with any pattern in a way, or one that is deceptive in some kind of an intentional sense, like something that might be used for a phishing attack, right? So probably better to think of the dark patterns as having a nefarious kind of side, and to be patterns, say, for phishing attacks, and patterns that just lead to bad outcomes. You probably should put them into the anti-pattern bin. Although that's not the way they do it in the discussion in the text. But I think that'll help your head. So design patterns, they capture design experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean only good designs. Oh, this is the slide for what I just said. My apologies. So again, we have anti-patterns, don't do it this way, and dark patterns, deliberate tricks. Okay? So I just want to spend a little bit more time on patterns, because patterns is really good stuff. Okay? To the extent that people in the structure architecture have been working with patterns, I think it's improved their practice. To the extent that people in software design and construction have been working with design patterns, I think that it has improved their practice as well. Likewise, it's going to improve the practice in interaction design. So I invite you to visit the two URLs that are in the text, and to find even more, and perhaps to share them with the class. This is a promising area for research, web surfing, or whatever. One of the things that really happens when you begin to start thinking in terms of these design patterns is that as soon as you see a product, you start to ask yourself, is this a new pattern? And certainly one product can use several patterns, so it's not a one pattern per product kind of thing. But anytime you see a new kind of interaction, you have to say to yourself, is this completely new? Is this a pattern? What do people call this pattern? What are what are people saying about this pattern? Do they think it's a pattern, or do they think it's an anti-pattern? Or in some cases, do they think it's a dark pattern, right? So I would say that putting some time into thinking about and keeping up to date on design patterns for interaction design would be time well spent for all of us. Open source resources. So there are a lot of resources around that can help us with our interaction design practice. The first is just what we were talking about, these design pattern libraries or galleries. To the extent that people who are part of our profession are sharing their idea about what they think appropriate patterns and anti-patterns are, then we ought to go find those and be knowledgeable about them and try to gain value through trying to use the patterns and to avoid the anti-patterns, right? There are also a bunch of tools that can be used for interactions, like the Bootstrap framework on the web. There are a lot of open source interaction-oriented either JavaScript and CSS frameworks, well, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS frameworks. There are lots of tools around that have standard interactions built into them. Okay, so they're kind of like a pattern, but they're more specific than that. They're interaction features. We can certainly recommend these be used in the products that we're helping to design. We might even, if we had some coding chops, we might even be able to take things like the pattern libraries and combine them with a little HTML and JavaScript and work up an interactive prototype ourselves, kind of homebrew it, not do it with some kind of a prototype generating tool. So here, this is an example of a website built using the Bootstrap framework. So you can take a look at that if you're not already familiar with that. And now we're going to come to a topic that is, I think, pretty important to people in our class, because we're coming up on the time where we're going to have to actually hand in things. We've got 2 practice assignments, we've got a final project, and we've got to do them using some tools, okay? So what tools? Well, they talk about some tools here in the chapter, and I'm going to mention a couple of others. But there are tools that support all aspects of this design process. There are things that help us in our creative thinking. There are things that help us with sketching, simulation, brainstorming, library search, mind mapping, video capture. I mean, those are all things that you're probably going to have to do in order to get, say, your final project done. There are a number of kind of individual tools that you can combine with others to create some kind of a workflow. Some of the products out there try to be a bit of a cradle-to-grave workflow in their own right. Now, 2 that they mention in the chapter that are mentioned on the slide here, are Balsamiq and Axure. These are 2 products that have been around a long time. They really got started as wireframing tools or mock-up tools. They have a relatively low fidelity, low polish kind of approach as their kind of entry-level quality of prototype. They both allow you to create multi-screen, clickable, interactive prototypes. Okay. Higher fidelity prototypes can be produced by using a couple of other products that I'm going to show you, or by linking an interactive wireframe to a design pattern library with software components. Okay, so let's take a look. I just want to explore here for a minute some various tools. So we've got Balsamiq, right? And if we look at Balsamiq, do we have this thing? Yeah. Here you can see some of the wireframing that they do, and as you can see, it's pretty sketchy looking. Okay, so we have that low fidelity kind of aspect. So this is the sketch skin. Where's the wireframe skin? This is the wireframe skin. There is a free version of it. There is some kind of a trial and all that kind of stuff. We don't have any kind of deal on it through our course, okay? But you can actually either work with the free version, which will give you, might be enough for you, or you can download the free trial, which at this point is, I think, 30 days in order to do this. So what would a tool like this allow you to do? It would allow you to come up with a kind of a low fidelity prototype. You see, for me, this might be high enough for a high fidelity prototype, in that it might capture all of the interaction the way we want to see it. Okay, and it would also allow you to link pages together and have some kind of a clickable experience. Okay, so whether this is appropriate for you kind of depends on how you come at this interaction design process. For me, this kind of a tool is appealing because I'm not an artist. I'm not a graphic artist. So before my designs are done, I'm going to have to team up with a graphic artist. Okay. And this is enough art for me. Okay. I just want to make sure, for instance, that I can show what all the parts of the interaction are and how they're going to work together. I'm probably going to need some help on the visual design. Okay, because I'm not a visual designer. How do I make up for that? Well, I think I understand the application well. I think I understand the principles of interaction design well. So I come at it from maybe the systems analysis point of view. That's where I'm going to be strong. I'm going to be weakest probably with my art skills. So a product like this that doesn't really allow you to show off your high-end art skills, well, that's fine by me, right? Because I don't have any, right? Okay, where could we go from this? Well, another very popular product is called Axure, and it has a free trial. Axure also has a deal for educational licenses, and I think I wrote away for those at least a week ago. Still haven't gotten an answer back, but if you're interested in an educational or an academic license to Axure, contact me and I'll see what I can do. Okay. This is a pretty interesting product. It's if we go to features, we can kind of see that we can design a lot of things, and we can have some pretty high fidelity. It seems to me that this is higher fidelity in terms of the interaction, in terms of the stuff that you can do. It's not that much higher fidelity in terms of artwork, though. Okay, because what's actually going on here is you are picking these widgets that you're going to put on the page, and the widgets are eventually get turned into HTML and JavaScript and get put out on a web app. And again, you can have an interactive prototype based upon, let's go back here. You can have an interactive prototype that runs, I think, on their server that looks pretty good. And again, for me, this is pretty good stuff because I'm not an artist. Okay, can I design an interaction based upon design patterns that I've seen or products that I've seen that perhaps represent good design patterns? Yeah, I certainly can. Would I like to be able to put together a prototype that can be used interactively? Yeah, I'd like to be able to do that. So this again is, I think, a great kind of tool for somebody with my background who's kind of claim to fame, whose strengths come from understanding the problem to being able to design the right business process. And I want to get enough of the graphic design done that I can turn it over to an artist to make it even prettier. Okay, but I'm not going to be the final artist. So this is a great kind of a place for me. And in terms of the demo that I'm going to do, I'm at work on creating one with the Axure product. Okay. So again, I think we will have academic licenses for that, and please contact me if you want to get hooked up with that when I get an answer back from the vendor. The third thing that you probably might want to take a look at, it's called InVision. Now this is This is another very popular product. If we were to let's just kind of click on the tour here, and we can kind of see the tools that they have. I think you can see from here that the fidelity, the fidelity of the art is very high. Okay, so you just look at this and you go, oh wow, this is really pretty stuff. Okay, now I just want to tell you that for me, this probably isn't a viable tool because you have to create the art that goes into it with another product. So they're assuming that you're going to create these PNG files that actually have the image of your page, either your web page or your mobile page. You're going to create them either with Photoshop or with another product called Sketch. Okay, they have very tight integrations with both Photoshop and Sketch, or you can create the artwork with any tool that will give you a PNG and just import it. So what do you do in this product? Well, this product allows you to take those images of your pages, create hotspots on them for clicking, and to arrange an interactive prototype in which you essentially click from image to image to image and get the experience of the real application. I'm probably not going to do a demo of this because I'm not that good of an artist. Okay, it probably would take me several weeks to turn out a good page design with Photoshop, probably less with Sketch, but both Photoshop and Sketch are paid tools, right? In terms of if you want to buy either Photoshop or Sketch, I think there's some kind of a deal to buy the Adobe products at UWM. So you could probably get some kind of a deal on Photoshop. There's a deal through the vendor for Sketch to get, I think it costs like $99. If you're a student, you can get it for half of that or something like that. But in my experience, students have not wanted to spend that kind of money on that kind of a tool. But with this kind of a tool, with a tool like InVision, you can use any kind of image creation software. Like if you have a Mac, you can use OmniGraffle. You can use whatever you want. You can, if you're an Adobe InDesign person, you can use Adobe InDesign. Whatever's going to turn out the PNGs that are going to give you the images of the pages, you can import into this. Not something I'm going to use because I don't think it really complements my skill sets. Okay, I think it complements the skill sets of a graphic artist more than me. Okay, well, your background may be completely different, right? So this may complement your skill set perfectly. And there's one more possibility that's a lot like InVision. I think it's going to be a head-to-head competitor with it. Adobe has got a free product that won't always be free. It's free because it's a beta product. It's called Adobe Experience Design, and it works a lot like InVision works. You're kind of expected to take the page images and to create them in a tool like Photoshop and then import them into Experience Design. Experience Design gives you the opportunity to create an interactive prototype again, which goes from screen image to screen image and simulates the actual application. From what I can see, these can be very high fidelity, very high polish prototypes. The only problem for me is I'm not that much of a graphic artist. Okay, so this is probably a slow way for me to go. A couple of people who have worked for me, for instance, there's a woman who worked for me at the University of Illinois when we designed a new website for the research center, and I did things by hand that were kind of wireframey, and she would take those and put them into Adobe InDesign to do the high fidelity prototype. And we didn't put them into a product like this to make them interactive because we didn't have the time or the inclination, but that would have been our next step. But having the InDesign skills that she had, I would probably use a product like this. Okay, so this product is free until they get it right, in which point they're going to start charging. Okay, in which case I think it'll probably be available on a student discount with other software that you can get through the university. But in the near term, it's free. Okay, so just to review, Balsamiq, been around a long time. It's a paid product. They don't offer free versions for students. Art-wise, it's, I would say, medium fidelity. Okay, high fidelity enough, I think, for us, though. Certainly for somebody who's coming at this from the point of view that I am, and does have the capability to create these click from view to view to view prototypes. Another feature that all of these things have that I didn't really talk about are the ability to share your designs with collaborators. That's not as important for us in the context of the projects we're going to do for the class, but it certainly is important in terms of your day job. The second one, Axure, again, probably from an artistic point of view, just a step up. Okay, so a little more high fidelity than Balsamiq. Still not high art like the other two products. We do, I think, have access to an education license, and they do have these collaboration tools, which will be important to us one day. And then we have the two more high art entries. We've got InVision, which does have a deal. I don't know if I said this before. Does have a deal for academic licenses, and if you contact me, I'll send the details. And again, probably is going to be most appealing for somebody with an artistic background, more of a graphic designer than I actually am. But for the right person, this is going to be a really sharp tool. And then we've got Adobe Experience Design, which we don't have. We don't have to get a license for because it's still in beta, so it's free, and it's probably pretty much head-to-head with InVision. And again, I think it's going to appeal the most to those of you who have a stronger graphic design background than I do. I'll be interested in what people have to say about tools, and always feel free to share those things with me and with the rest of the class. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, I think we've got a summary one. So This Agile approach to interaction design is being called AgileUX for user experience. It refers to approaches that integrate UX design and Agile software development. It requires a bit of a change in the mindset by the designers and the developers. The developers who have adopted it have already had a change in mindset. So it's up to us, if we want to become a part of this approach, to have a change ourselves. The requirements are repeatedly reprioritized, which aims to avoid wasted effort. The UX design activities need rethinking compared to what we said in previous chapters. When we're going to do an activity, how much of it we're going to do, and how to take that forward. And essentially, what really seems to work the best here is a parallel path activity, whereby we have the interaction designer or designers working a sprint or two ahead, an iteration or two ahead of the developers. We talked about design patterns, which I think are just a great idea, and I can't emphasize enough how much time that you take to investigate further will be generously rewarded. And then we talked about some open source resources, and then we went through 4 possible tools that you might want to use. Okay? So we've now come down to the part where we can actually do it, I think. We probably are not going to be doing it in this kind of agile way. Again, if you have the resources to do this as some kind of an agile development project and you want to do it, I'm probably not going to stop you. All right? I'd be interested to see how you're going to do it. But I'm not expecting. Okay, that's it for this chapter, and I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.